Congratulations! Kudos to you! You will be given the opportunity to make your very own animated After Effects intro for your logo, just like this one.
Okay, let's start. So first you want to find some free vector geometric shapes that we're going to be using in this intro. So you'll just look up free geometric shapes wallpaper and click that icon there, and then you can search all these different backgrounds and such. Like you can use this one here, like I animated this one earlier. So with that, you can just pick any background with any colors or shapes that you like. That's just to show you that you can use any. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to be using this background image here, which you'll just hit download and use free download. You'll find this link in the description below. And jump right into Illustrator, find the size that you like, just hit create, and then just plop that vector image right in. You just want the .ai, and then you'll want to edit the original because right now it's just that, and then close that out since we don't need the font. And now you can edit all the elements in Illustrator, but that's not what we want for After Effects. We want them in their own layers. So we can do that by just opening everything up and then scroll and make a new layer. And then we're just going to use the top right elements and just drag and I'll drop in those to put in that top layer. And now that we have that in its own layer, we can do that with the others. So you'll just continue dividing them up by their area and their location, and just do that for all of them. And then you can rename them all, so that'll just make it easier when we go into After Effects, which we can do by hitting save as. Just rename it to whatever you want and hit save, and then hit OK and jump right into After Effects. In here you'll just hit import that file that you just created earlier, and then you want that as not as a footage but as a composition, and retain the layer sizes and plop that into the timeline. And then in here you'll just want to change some of the settings. So you go into the composition settings. I'm just making it a bit bigger so we have some more quality, and then 30 frames per second, and then you want the duration to be 8 seconds long. Alright, and then I'll just bump up the scale a bit so it covers the entire screen, and then I am going to rasterize it since it's not full quality, and then go into that composition and just enable the rasterizing for all the other layers. And now what I'm doing is I'm just hiding and shying those intro layers because we don't need them for right now. So what we can start doing is adding keyframes for the position keyframes. We can just hit P on the keyboard to open that up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around this in the center, and I'm going to mark that and by a bookmark here. And we're going to call this the breakpoint. This is where all the elements are going to be in the middle. We're going to have them all mixed together at the middle there. So I'm just going to add a keyframe there, and then at the beginning as well. And then scroll back to the end, near the end, and add a keyframe there. And then I'm going back to the middle to change the keyframes, which I'm going to do by just mixing them around. Just put them in random order, because at the breakpoint we just want everything to be mixed and unorganized as possible, because this is where everything is going to be kind of exploding or imploding to the center. And now we're going to go back to the beginning, and we're going to change those keyframes as well, because we want it to start outside of the composition. So we'll just move them outside of the composition, and we want it to be above the second keyframe that we made earlier. And we'll do that with all of them, just making sure that it's above and outside of the composition, above its second keyframe, and do that with all the others. And now if we were to play it through, this is what we have. It's not very good. It's not very good at all. So some key changes we can do is make the ones that don't move a lot start later on. So since these keyframes are short together, we'll move that position keyframe so it starts later on compared to others. And since this one is in the middle, it won't move that much. This one's at the end, we're just going to have it start at the beginning and do that with all the others. And now what we can do is ease it by hitting F9 on the keyboard. That will just make it much smoother. And then go into the graph editor, change up the graphs a bit, just make it look similar to this one here. And now if we play it through, this is what we have. It's a bit jumpy because we do want it jumpy. So there's a few things that we can do by adding some rotation to it, which we can do by adding a null layer, just renaming that, and then select all the other layers except for the background layer and parent that to the control. And then I'll go to scale by hitting S. And in the scale, we're going to paste in this expression and all the expressions. And then what this allows us to do is in the null object, change the scale without changing the size of each element. And just do that with all the others. And what that means, if we go into the scale and just change that property, it normally changes the size of all the elements, but now since we added that expression, it doesn't. So the size remains constant. And with that understanding, we can add some keyframes to it. So one for the scale, the center, the breakpoint, and then about 2 seconds before, add another keyframe there, and then 2 seconds after, add a keyframe there. And then we'll go back to the middle and then move that down so it's all crunched together, and that's it. So we can ease that by hitting F9 again, go into the graph editor, change up the graph so it looks like how we want it, just make it look similar to this one here. It. If we play it through, this is what it has. Again, a bit jumpy, but that's what we want. We can change that jumpiness by adding some rotation to it, just making it more smooth. We can add a keyframe at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end here. And then if we go back to the middle and we go to 240 degrees, 2/3 the way of 360, and then go to the end and just make that one full rotation. We can select all the keyframes here and hit F9 like we did with the scale, go into the graph editor, but this time we're going to edit the values of the graph. So now if we play it through, this is what we have. It's starting to look like what we had in the beginning when I showed you that clip. Now what we're going to do is we're going to select the end keyframes of the position keyframes just to move it around, just to make it more organic, so it all looks like they're on different times. What we're going to be doing is changing this, because at the breakpoint everything seems all the same. It's a box, it looks boxy, and we want this to be more flow like a circle. So I'm just going to be moving these elements out and around, and then I'm going to make sure that they're above their second keyframe like we did before, and just do that with all the other elements here. Cool. And if we play it through, this is what we have. You'll notice that that breakpoint looks pretty good, but again, they all look like they're the same. So we can affect that by adding some rotation. So by hitting R on the keyboard and then just open up that, add a keyframe at the center and then at the beginning and then near the end, like we did with the position keyframes. At the middle, at the breakpoint, I'm just going to move it 240 degrees, like we did with the null object, and then go to the end and add one full rotation by typing 1. And then we can make this smoother because right now it all looks very not smooth. So we'll just select all of those, hit F9 on the keyboard, go into the graph editor, but we're going to go in the value graph to give us some more control over this and just make the graph look like this. And this is what we have, but they all look like they are on the same rotation because, well, they are. So we can change that by just changing up the graph of each element like so. And then if we have that, just makes it a little more or less organic. And to make it more organic, we can change up the end keyframes like we did with the position keyframes before. And now we can add all the elements, the intro elements before, and then pre-compose that by just renaming that. And then we want to enable rasterizing for that so we have its vector form. And now, since we exported this as an Illustrator file, it came into After Effects without the shadow, so we can change that by going into the shadow layer and then make shapes from vector layer. And then delete that second one, and then go and duplicate that, since in this layer there are two parts, the shadow and some other elements that we don't want. So we're just going to find the one with the shadow, which is this one, and delete everything else except for the shadow in this layer there. And then do the same thing for the duplicate, and just delete everything, just the shadow in this layer here. And we'll just rename that shadow for the bottom layer since that's the shadow. And in here, we'll just search up blur and apply this blur to that layer and increase that a bunch. And this will just give it its shadow effect, change the color to black. And then we can go into transforms and just tone this down a bit. And with that same knowledge, I'm going to do that to the second one as well, the one on the top. And with that done, I'm just going to add the logo here, nothing really special. I'm just going to use the type tool and type out logo here, nothing really much. This is where you would put your logo. And I'm just going to move that a bit, duplicate, change the background color to be orange, and pre-comp those two layers together just to make everything organized. Rename it, hit OK. And what I'm going to do here is move the arrows out on the top and the bottom out, so just to give the logo some room. Now we can start some animations for this composition here. But first we'll just enable rasterizing just to give its vector layer. To animate it, I'm going to duplicate this layer, and in this I'm just going to open the contents, and I want to find only this blue circle here, and I'm going to move this above the text layer, and I'm going to toggle that so we can use the alpha matte. It looks like it hasn't done much, but if we open the position keyframes of the text and move it up and down, you'll notice that it just doesn't go outside the circle, which we can use for the animation. So for this, I'm just going to go to the center, add a keyframe there for the position, and then go to near the end, and then add a keyframe there, go back to the beginning, and just make it look like an angle, like going up at an angle. We can easily use that by hitting F9, go into the graph editor, change up the graph a bit to make it look similar to this, and if we play it through, this is what we have now. Awesome. And then with that, if we go back to the main composition, this is what we have, and it doesn't really look good because it just doesn't fit. So we'll move it so it starts at the breakpoint because that's when we want it to, and then we'll link that to the control null object that we had before, which you can use by the line or the list, and that does all the work for us. So now it will just come in the way we want it to. And with that done, we can go back into the composition and add some more animations to this just to make it pop. So for this one, I'm going to animate the lines and the arrow, which you can do by hitting create the shapes from vector, duplicate that, and then go into the contents of this and find all the groups that have the line and arrow and delete everything else. And then in the top one, just find everything except, and then delete all the lines and the arrows in that one, and then rename that line and the top one circle, since the top one has that donut shaped orange circle at the top there. And then in this one, if we wanted to rotate it, you notice that it doesn't rotate properly because the anchor point isn't at the center, which we can move that by using the tool and just put that in the center of the circle, which happens to be the center of that line with the arrows. Beautiful. So we can just add some animations by adding some keyframes, go into graph editor, change up the graph a bit, and this is what we have, just a smooth, subtle movement with the rotation. And with the same process, I'm going to animate some of the other elements in this composition just to make it pop some more. And if we go back to the composition, the main composition, this is what we have. But now we can start animating some of the other individual elements. So for these, like for this one at the bottom left corner, I'm going to animate this. So you'll just basically do the same process by hitting pre-compose, but in this one you want to leave all the attributes in the layer and then go into the composition, go in the composition settings, and just increase the width and height of the composition just to give us some more room. And I'm going to animate a line that goes around, so I'm just going to create the shapes from vector, delete that bottom layer because we don't need that, and I'm going to use the pen tool to trace around that line by holding shift just to make sure that the lines are straight across. And then since we don't want it to be a shape, a line, we want it to be a line, we can just disable the fill and enable the line on that and change the color to be something darker like black here. And since we don't need the line on the bottom layer, I'm going to open the contents and delete that line from this group. And with that done, we can start animating it. We'll add a trim path and we can animate the line moving across by just going to the middle, add a keyframe there, go to the end, add a keyframe there, and then in the beginning and add a keyframe there. And if we go back to the middle, change that line so you can't see anything visible, and highlight those, hit F9 to ease that, just change up the graph a bit. In the end, this is what we have for the line here after we change all the keyframes. So now with that done, if we go back to the main composition, you'll notice that it's pretty subtle, but it's just that little subtle detail. And with that, we can animate some of the other elements in this composition here. For the next one, I'm going to animate this one by using virtually the same process, by just changing the size, creating shapes from vector, and just finding all the groups in that layer. In this one, I'm actually making a mask. Now, I'm just going to do that with all the other elements, just using that same idea in mind. And then you just animate all the other layers and elements however your heart desires. Anyways, if we played that through, this is what we have. It's very subtle, but it just makes it pop some more. Another subtle thing that we can do to make it pop is adding some motion blur, because with this there's normally some motion, but we don't see that here. And you can enable that by just enabling this icon here for them. But you'll notice that there is this minus sign on some of the compositions, which you'll just have to go in the compositions and enable that through there. With some of them, you don't see that option. You'll just have to go to the bottom, enable the toggle, and do that from there. And I'm just doing that with all the others. And now if we go back to the beginning composition that we had, you'll notice that you don't see anything because you need to enable this icon here. Let's say you don't like the motion blur with this. You can change it by going to the composition settings, and in the advanced tab, change the shutter angle. A smaller shutter angle number means there isn't that motion blur, but a higher shutter angle number means there's a lot of motion blur. But for right now, I'm just going to stick with this number here. That just works for this animation. And that's basically it. But before you export it out, you just want to make sure that everything is a-okay. So you just play it through in the composition right now. Since you have the chance, it might take a while, so I'm just going to cut through. And we're done. So if you play it through, this is what we have. You notice that the motion blur, there isn't that much, but it's just that subtle detail that makes the animation pop. And now you can just add to the rendering option and just change up the settings. I'm going to use the Apple ProRes 444. And with that just works for the animation that I have on the computer I have. And then I'm going to disable the audio since we don't need that. And then you're going to define a location and a name for your animation. Hit save on that and hit render. There you go. You're all done. But before you leave me, just please note that if you made this in After Effects, you made a template. You can put any logo that you want into the composition. You can just drag and drop and put any logo like I did before, just underneath all the layers. And that's it. That's all I have for you for this tutorial. Thank you for watching.